Hello and welcome. I'm Melinda Crane, and here's this week's agenda. No help for migrants. Tragedy at the gates of Europe. Reluctant coalition courtship. Could Angela Merkel go green? And can the Pope's Gang of Eight reform the Roman Curia? We've invited three guests to look beyond the headlines of three of this week's biggest news stories. And I start out by welcoming Martin Gach. He is a religious morality philosopher. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the New School for Social Research, and he just finished conducting the first meta-ethics workshop at Berlin's Free University. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Green Party Member of Parliament Thomas Gamke. He's a physicist by training, and he was elected to the German Bundestag in 2009 and focuses on financial issues and energy. And it's also a pleasure to have with us today Wolfgang Büttner. He's press officer and associate advocate with Human Rights Watch, one of several human rights organizations to sharply criticize EU immigration policy in the wake of the recent deaths of refugees off the coast of Italy. I'd like to start out by asking all three of you whether the loud cries of outrage from NGOs and the media and politicians are really going to make a difference in EU refugee policy. What do you think, Martin Gach?
I think not. I mean, the short run, there will be the outburst of rage and indignation, but I think that there is very little possibility that there will be really, critical reforms in the immigration policy, especially in the short run.
Thomas Gamke?
Well, I would agree. I think I'm not very confident that European politics will change. We will talk about Angela Merkel later, but I think she should play an important role in changing European politics in terms of how to deal with refugees.
Wolfgang Büttner.
Actually, we think that the international media are a tool to put pressure on the politics and on the European Union. And so we think now it's a possibility to increase the pressure on the EU policy and to put the individual of the refugee in the center and no longer border control.
So what the media can achieve, we want to see that in the course of our program. It's certainly not the first time that refugees from some of Africa's poorest nations died within sight of European shores. Any attempt to help migrants who make it to the coast of Italy risk violating strict immigration laws. The tragedy is prompting new debate, but is Fortress Europe really ready to open its gates a bit wider?
Last week, a boat overloaded with migrants from Somalia and Eritrea capsized and sank off the coast of Lampedusa. Many of the 500 Africans on board could not swim. Efforts to search for survivors and recover the dead are continuing. It's believed that around 300 people perished in the accident. The tragedy has raised questions about laws making it difficult for migrants to reach European shores. Critics say restrictive immigration policy puts migrants in danger. There have been calls for the EU to open its borders and show solidarity with the less fortunate. It's not the first boat disaster involving migrants risking their lives in an attempt to flee war and poverty. But is Europe really to blame?
Wolfgang Büttner, let's pick right up on that blame question. Now, apparently Italian law actually forbids fishermen or other people who are out in the water in a boat from rendering assistance to drowning migrants. Otherwise, they might be accused of being accomplices in illegal immigration. That seems extraordinarily heartless.
Yeah, we think, this is one of the wrong regulations with regard to the refugee policy. And in particular, we criticize, of course, this Italian law, which says that commercial vessels and fish trawlers should not take up refugees because then they can be regarded as smugglers and be fined. But I think this is only one aspect of the EU refugee policy which must be changed. There are many issues which we would like to change, in particularly with the sea control and the rescue operations. There should be better cooperation between the EU states, between Malta, between Italy, between Greece and Spain. We think it's important to make clear what a distress signal by the overboarded migrant boats mean. And of course, we think it's extremely important that the refugees, when they come to the soil, to the Italian soil, to the Greek soil, that they get a proper asylum procedure.
Let's remember exactly how the EU system works. We might say the very dysfunctional EU system on refugee policy. Basically, it is the receiving country that has to deal with an influx of refugees. Is that right? There is no correct way to distribute the burden, and that means that a country like Italy, that is essentially on the front line here in this struggle, is basically left in the lurch by other members of the EU. Is that right?
Absolutely. So that's also one of our main concerns with regard to the EU refugee policies. It's the so-called Dublin regulation, which says that the country where the refugee puts his foot first on soil is responsible then for the asylum procedure and for dealing with refugees. And of course, this gives the huge burden on the countries on the external EU borders. This means it's Italy, it's Greece as well, it's Malta, it's Spain who are carrying the burden, and this must be changed.
We've been talking about the need for better coordinated EU refugee policy for what, nearly 20 years now? Why doesn't it happen?
That's really a pity, but of course there are different interests between the states of the European Union, and recently there was a reform of the EU refugee system. Now we have the Dublin III regulations, and there were some positive aspects of this reform. For example, better protection for minors, better protection for vulnerable groups, better appeal mechanisms, but the Dublin regulation, which means that the countries on the external border are responsible for the refugees, is still in force, and this was really a big problem of this reform, and we were criticizing that.
Let's go to our other guests to get their insights on this. Martin Gak, you are a moral philosopher. There were headlines this week saying that Europe's values drowned off the coast of Italy. Is that putting it too strongly, or would you agree?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's putting it necessarily too strongly. I just don't think it's quite accurate. I don't think the problem here is that the values have actually sunk. I think that the problem is that there is a form of neglect under which I think we operate on a daily basis. I think that very often reality is just too horrific to be taken at face value, and I think that if we really make ourselves personally responsible of every event of this characteristic, our days would be extraordinarily long and extraordinarily tough. On the other hand, I think that your question was actually really quite interesting at the beginning. I was immediately thinking we just got the revelations of the NSA, which for most people in Germany should have been absolutely bombastic. And they really figured very low, I mean, in the agenda for the elections. So, to be perfectly honest, I mean, 200 dead people off the coast of Italy is news for the next 2 weeks. And this is the true tragedy, I mean, which is that it's not that the values have sunk, it's that we do have a generic crisis of political values. As a matter of fact, I would add one more thing, which is that all the political instruments that might actually issue from this crisis will pale in comparison to the holistic or true holistic approach. The problem that we're having in Lampedusa is that a lot of these people are coming from Syria, Eritrea, and Somalia. And these are countries in which Europe could really have a leading role in reconstructing and bettering the situation so that we don't have a constant hemorrhage of people.
The question is always, when we talk about values, Thomas Gamke, whether people in the end make policy on the basis of values or on the basis of interests. Let's take a look at Germany's interests. This is a very rich country. Is it doing enough for the refugees, and would German taxpayers be willing to do more?
Well, I do think that we are not doing enough, and I am hesitant to believe that the taxpayers in Germany will really, if they would not get a lead to do so, to change. And at the moment, I think they are more anxious to keep what they have than be willing to give more. And not talking about the refugees, but the situation in Europe. We consider, well, I see that the outcome of the election is that we are more anxious to keep what we have. So I think I'm quite hesitant to believe that Angela Merkel and the CDU, the Christian Democrats, will actually act as they should, as being Christians. So my hope is actually in Germany that the church will try to step in. I have not seen in the last 2 or 3 days any remark of Angela Merkel about Lampedusa refugees.
People in your own party have called for Germany, for example, to take in 10 times as many refugees from Syria as it has been doing. It has just taken in 5,000, but there were calls from some members of the Green Party to take in 50,000. We are seeing refugee numbers go up in Germany. At the same time, we're also seeing demonstrations from people in the areas where the refugees are quartered, saying, we don't want this home for refugees in our neighborhood. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, therefore, I said it is really a question of the leading, and they have nearly the majority. It would be actually the task of the Christian Democrats in saying, look, gentlemen, we have the situation that the refugees are coming in, that we have the situation in Syria, and we need to change that. And I'm really disappointed that I don't see or listen to these statements from the leading politicians in this country.
Wolfgang Büttner, do you have a good solution how to deal with that potential backlash if Germany, for instance, were to open its doors wider? What do you do? How do you convince people that's the right thing to do in their own interests?
I think important is to know that the European Union and the member states of the European Union are part of a value system, and human rights are on the top of this value system. So they all were obliged by EU conventions and other international conventions to protect international human rights, and it's the basis of our living together. I mean, that's what makes the European Union, that's what gives us a wealthy living standard here in the European Union. And I think then we should also look at the refugees and transfer these values to them, and see that they need protection, that there is a huge problem in with refugees, and that we have to tackle this problem.
Martin Gak, we're going to come back to the Pope later on in the program, but just to build the bridge here, he in fact went to Lampedusa not all too long after he entered the papacy and visited that island to send a signal. Do you think that signal was heard, received?
Well, I think that the signal was received by those of us who were listening closely. I think that two very interesting things happened. I wanted to point out something. I mean, this week actually was the 70th anniversary of the Danish exodus of the Jewish community, which was actually shipped by sea, escaped the Nazis, into Sweden. And I mean, in an irony of history, probably, we saw this very moment of being reminded on two fronts. I think that, as a matter of fact, what are our values as, inheritors of 20th century European history? I think that one of the things that the Pope did in Lampedusa, which is truly remarkable, is to actually flex muscle and point out that we have entered a period, I mentioned this before, I'll say it again, a period of political crisis, or a crisis of political values. And even if you're not a believer, one of the things that politically the Church can do is actually become a reminder of the value agenda for Europe. I think that, as a matter of fact, the Pope could effectively, and the people that are now beginning to surround the system, could effectively do this.
Thomas Gumke, let's say that that wake-up call does get heard and that the EU actually now does start to try to negotiate a somewhat more rational and humane immigration policy. Is that really going to solve the problem here? The fact is, we just mentioned, these are some of the poorest countries in Africa that these people came from. Another boatload on the same day did make it to Lampedusa, people from the war-torn regions of the Middle East. Are they really going to stay put just because EU policy relaxes a bit, or do we have a short-term, long-term problem here that those flows are going to keep on coming even if the policy improves?
Well, absolutely. The situation is that we not only have to look at what we can do within Europe, what we need to do at the border, we need to do something in the countries themselves the refugees are coming from. And in this respect, I'm rather disappointed that we had an agreement within the Western world to spend 0.7% of our gross national product on helping these countries. And in the green and red government, we stick to that, and even in the big coalition from 2005 to 2009, actually it's in the coalition agreement between the liberals and the conservatives, but they didn't follow the rule. So I think we are not doing as much as we have already committed to do. And coming to the situation of the Greens, when we said we need a bit more money to spend part of that was that we have to get the money, what we have committed, the 0.7%, and we need to put this money into the countries to help them, and hopefully by doing that, taking necessary steps that the refugees not anymore need to come to Europe on the reason that they starve, they have no money for their living.
But once again, there we run into a question of interests. I was recently talking to somebody who was engaged in coalition negotiations, and he said the ministry that takes care of development assistance, that's practically the lowest on the totem pole. That's the one nobody's really very interested in. Briefly, because we just are about to move on to our next topic, Wolfgang Büttner, when we look at that blame game that we started out with at the top, one of the frequently mentioned usual suspects is human smuggling operations. The German Interior Ministry has just said those are the ones who really make this problem worse. Is that right? To what degree are they at fault, and what do we need to do differently to rein them in?
I mean, of course, these smugglers are a huge problem, but I think it's important not to forget that it's not the reason why the refugees are leaving the countries. And of course, there must be a means to stop them. I mean, there are several possibilities to do that. We have the Frontex operations who also go against the smugglers. We have a new surveillance system in the European Union which is against the smugglers. But this should not forget that nevertheless the European Union has the responsibility to accept the refugees and to see their plight. And I think it's also in this context important to know not only to see the refugees as victims. I mean, they're fleeing of persecution, they're fleeing of economic distress, they're fleeing because of wars, but also to see which risk they're taking. I mean, they're on completely dilapidated ships. They're going the risk of dying when coming to Europe. I think it's very important to see how brave they are, and then to give them a proper reception in the European Union, to give them a proper asylum procedure. I think that's important.
Here in Germany, left-leaning politicians are demanding that immigration policy be put on the short list of topics for coalition negotiations. And they might get their way, for despite her strong showing, Chancellor Angela Merkel must court one of the opposition parties in order to build a governing coalition. Her Conservatives have held their first talks with the Social Democrats, and they're now making overtures to the Green Party. Until the election, that pairing would have looked improbable indeed. But in the wake of a rather dismal showing, the Greens have thrown out their left-leaning leaders and are looking distinctly more compatible to conservative matchmakers.
It wasn't a good election result for Germany's Greens. The electorate punished the party at the polls. The Greens were hoping to improve on their 2009 result of 10.7%, but ended up with just 8.4%. It was a dramatic drop that led most of the leadership to step down. But now Germany's environmental party is in an interesting position. Joining forces with its traditional partners, the SPD, would not give it a majority. But the Greens could play a queenmaker role for Angela Merkel's CDU. The Greens in an alliance with the Conservatives? Unthinkable 4 years ago. But the dramatic shift in Germany's political landscape means an unlikely coalition could be in the making. The Greens have some tough choices ahead.
Well, Thomas Gemke, your party has already made a few tough choices. It just ditched the leadership that had been responsible for the election campaign. Is that an admission that the Green Party has been on the wrong track of late?
Well, I think it is not really the wrong track, but what we had been overambitious, so to speak. We described as being the party who has sustainability, that is a long-range view on things. And definitely if you have a long-range view on energy politics, on other things the society needs to move on, we tried to describe in the nutshell of a election program of the year 2013, things which need possibly 20 years to come. And I think that has been so we are on track. However, we did more than 2 steps ahead.
But the fact is that most voters were getting the message during the election campaign that your core issues, your key issues, were things like raising taxes and Vegetarian Day, a day on which everybody supposedly was going to eat vegetables. Now, that really isn't what the Green Party used to stand for. So what happened?
This is correct. I think we had been too precise, or we tried to be rather precise in describing the tools which we need to change. Take the Vegetarian Day. Of course, the Veggie Day was found, we need to change our lives. Yes. I mean, looking 20 years ahead and how to feed the population on the earth we have to cope with the resources, limited resources we have to change our lives. I had been the Committee for Growth, Well-being and Quality of Life in the Deutsche Bundestag, and even the liberals agreed that we need to change our lives on the way to be able to live in this world. That had been the task, and the tool of a Veggie Day was not accepted, of course, because it was accepted or was looked at as a threat more than, the way we need to go.
So you're telling me you concentrated too much on the means and perhaps left the end, the goals out of sight. Is that partly because Angela Merkel and her Christian Democrats stole your thunder over the last 4 years with their energy transformation, moving away from nuclear and conventional sources to renewables, leaving the Green Party perhaps in search of a mission?
Well, I think, to a certain extent, Angela Merkel said, yes, we want to go away from nuclear. But she did not move really in terms of making a change. And by trying to explain that to the people, we said, okay, we need the next steps, which is more wind energy, to have a real new structure of how to organize our energy markets. And you have to look into details to explain that. And actually, yes, she stayed there and said, okay, we go out of nuclear, that's all. And we said, no, we have to go step by step. And I think we couldn't explain to the people what are the next steps, what need to be done. And therefore, the people said, okay, we still keep with Angela Merkel out of nuclear, but that's enough. If it goes to details, it may become tough, and we don't want that.
Given the fact that the CDU has moved into your territory with its green energy policy, does that mean that your party has been reduced more and more to being a little niche party on the margins of German politics? Is it increasingly perhaps a party without a clear identity?
No, I would absolutely disagree, because the center of the green politics is still how can we live in this world with limited resources. And I'm not talking about the climate, I'm talking about any kind of resources we have. I mean, for the time being, we have in Lower Bavaria, where I'm coming from, 10% of the area we need is in Argentina, actually, of getting enough nutrition for our agriculture industry, where we export to China. And I think this is absolutely the wrong way how to do that. And I think what we could not explain is what are really the next necessary steps in the direction which I think we need to go into a sustainable world, more than in trying to say, okay, we want to stick on the consumer world we have, where most of the people, by the way, say, no, that's not the way how we think we can live in the future.
Martin Gach, you've been in this country for some years now. As a moral philosopher, do you see a clear message from the Green Party in terms of where we need to head as a society?
Well, I think the Green Party has still a good brand name to actually set, once again, questions of political values within the agenda. I think that this is something that clearly the SPD and the CDU have not quite managed. I mean, the sense from looking at these elections is that I think that anybody that claims that this was a massive victory for Merkel is probably watching another channel. I mean, a woman that essentially just lost in the Bundestag her only ideological associate and is left with 3 left-wing parties to deal with, cannot consider it to be a great success. The fact, however, is that the sense here is not that there was a great revamping of political values. This was mostly something that looked like, well, why should we fix a problem we don't have? Now, I think that the Greens could have done a much better job at explaining that there are certain political values that we cannot simply let slip. For instance, once again, let me mention the NSA. The NSA was a perfect opportunity to basically counteract the Merkel claim, which was, I talk about those things that people care about. Sometimes an act of political will and political courage is actually to talk about things and to make part of the agenda things that we come to consider to be sacrosanct, but that the political system is not particularly interested in. So I think that these are certainly possibilities.
Wolfgang Büttner, 4 years ago, there was a lot of excitement about the idea of a possible coalition between Christian Democrats and Greens, and possibly also the Liberals, the Free Democrats, who are now out of Parliament altogether. People used to talk about that as the Jamaica coalition. These days, there's not nearly as much magic when you think about a potential Christian Democratic Green coalition. How do you see it? Is that something that could stir your imagination?
Actually, we don't give any political recommendations on coalitions. So we are an independent human rights organization.
How about as you personally, as a German voter?
And we try to put forward our human rights issues and human rights recommendations. But of course, what we did in advance of the elections, we sent a questionnaire to all the fractions in the German Bundestag, and we got replies. And of course, there were lots of overlapping between the replies we got from the Green Party and our political stances and our political recommendations. And of course there are, the programmatic issues, but on the other hand, it's of course always the people. The people who are sitting in parliament, who are in government, whether they are close to human rights issues, where they want to pick up human rights issues. And so I think you can find these people in all of the fractions. It's then up to us, on the one hand, to try to get their support, but also, of course, to get our recommendations into the program.
Thomas Gömke, it is sometimes said that the Greens could potentially be the true conservatives or the true libertarians. They stand for things like opportunity, education, and certainly preservation of creation. What do you think? Is that a direction that you could see your party making a more clear commitment to in the future after all the soul searching?
Yes, I think we have to go back to the green nucleus which we have. But put it in this way, it's not only the green policy in terms of ecological things. Take Lampedusa. I think when we talk to Angela Merkel at Thursday, I'm very confident that one of the 5 items I know we are talking about will be how will you, Angela Merkel, deal with the Lampedusa refugee situation? And I think if we talk about whether we come together or not, I think this will be a strong demand which we have. You need to make clear to us that you will join us in trying to change policies in terms of how do we deal with refugees. So that will be one item.
Briefly, on to tactics. Some parties seem to believe that Angela Merkel is something like a black widow spider who chews up her junior coalition partners and spits them out as small remnants of what they were before. Is that something you're worried about? Could you imagine entering a coalition with the Christian Democrats and coming out stronger?
Yes, I think we could. If we could, what she's doing, she is not, to my understanding, she uses very, very carefully the opinion and mood within the population. And she has a very good sense and not to lead, but to take that on what is the discussion right now. And she changes, by the way, her mind. The very important question for us of nuclear power, she changed 180 degrees within 1 year. And she will do the same. And I think we have to show that we have certain ethics, that we have certain values. And from my understanding, actually, if we turn again to these values and make sure that we communicate them, the people will follow us more than the 8.5% in the last election we had.
Very, very briefly, if you would, your party also tends to change its mind. There is a real division within the party, including about whether to go together with the Christian Democrats. Would your grassroots supporters really go for such a match?
if we can have considerable part of our politics find it in a coalition agreement, yes.
Thank you very much. Well, the transformation that the Greens are undergoing looks modest in comparison with what's being undertaken at the Vatican. A week ago, Pope Francis and 8 cardinals from around the world began meeting to discuss the Vatican's troubled administration, the Curia, and map out possible changes in the worldwide church. The goal, to restore humility to an institution often referred to as the world's last Renaissance court.
The Vatican is ruled by the Pope, who wields absolute power there, at least in theory. The reality is somewhat different. In 2012, the VatiLeaks affair threw a spotlight on corruption within the church administration. Worldwide, the church faces many challenges. The number of priests is dwindling, but the Pope has ruled out the ordination of women. Homosexuality, contraception, and abortion are further points of contention, as are the ongoing attempts to come to terms with child abuse scandals involving priests. Pope Francis has surprised the faithful with remarks on how the Church has lost touch with the real world. Last week, he met with a council of cardinals for historic talks on change. But can the Catholic Church really reform?
Martin Gak, and of course reform in the face of some very powerful vested interests. Last week, the Vatican Bank revealed that it is closing 1,000 apparently illegal accounts. That's the scope of these problems just within the Vatican Bank. What do you think? Can one Jesuit pope, even if he is very, very tough, go up against those kind of vested interests and win?
Well, he has clearly conserved power for the better part of 10 years. We have to bear in mind that this man was actually the main candidate for the last papacy. And the only reason why Benedict became pope is because he himself, in the conclave, stepped up and said, I am not ready to be pope. So he himself put himself out of the run. This goes to say that if 8 years later he managed to become pope, it's because that power base remained, for all intents and purposes, intact. And this shows a man of actually great muscle, indeed. The second part to this is that if you have been following the political life of Bergoglio in Argentina before this thing got started in Rome, this is a man that has carried this soft voice and incredible political muscle, mainly through gestural cues. For a very, very long time, he managed actually from the church in the middle of all this crisis to push a populist left-wing government from the left. So this man managed to talk about poverty against a government that was basically building its entire platform on the notion of correcting poverty. So the answer is yes.
Let's briefly take a look at his chosen allies in this process, the cardinals who are being called the Gang of Eight. They are cardinals. To what degree are they really outside the troubled system that is at the root of the problem?
They are outside. So the Curia is essentially the administrative body of the Church, and the Curia Romana is the administrative body of the Vatican in particular. The Curia is divided into something like ministries, which are called. Sorry, it escapes me right now. But I'll come back to the name. Will come back to me. So the point is that the structure of the Curia has essentially been completely crystallized, and this means that all the worst vices, administrative vices of the systems, have been almost impossible to weed out. So what he has done is essentially gone out and looked for people that were standing in very powerful positions. This is certainly the case with Maradiaga from Tegucigalpa, who was actually a papabile, and he has brought them into the church to basically reform the Curia. There is only one person in the Gang of Eight, in the G8, who is actually part of the Curia. And there is a further point to be made, which is Parolin, which is the guy that is probably going to become the Secretary of State. Actually, it's not even a cardinal. Will be made a cardinal, but so far is not a cardinal. So clearly the point here is that there will be a renewal, but it's a renewal that will have to do with renovating and upgrading the structures of the church.
We've heard some very, very strong words from the Pope. Last week, he told an Italian newspaper that there are courtiers within the Vatican and that they amount to leprosy for the church. Very strong words indeed. Number one, I wonder, is that really helpful to the reform process, or does that just put people's backs up? Number two, what does he really have in mind? He talks about changing that hierarchical structure into something horizontal, but what does that mean?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I think that this is a man of measured words, so it was truly, truly surprising, which goes to say that he put somebody on notice. I mean, clearly, we do not know who these people are in particular. We can partly assume that they probably have to do with the groups that were circulating around Sodano, though we don't know this for sure. But clearly this was, this was a declaration of war. And then the issue that comes with this is the horizontalization of the church will mainly have to do with the inclusion of two things: the laity, which will begin to form part of take part in sort of more of the business of the church, and second, the synod of bishops, which until now was mostly a consultative body, but did not really have much autonomy. This is something that seems will actually be changed quite immediately.
Let's find out what kind of changes our other guests are expecting. Thomas Gamke mentioned the potential role of the church in calling attention to values. Well, many people feel that the Catholic Church's voice has been greatly muted of late by its extreme conservatism. Are you expecting real changes on substance in matters like homosexuality, for example, or the role of women, birth control, or do you think this is more about style than substance?
Well, I'm not in the position to expect, I hope. And I think it would be very necessary. I think the religion, more than I thought, by the way, is becoming even stronger in terms of their influence on society. And I recall Sepp Daxenberger. Sepp Daxenberger was heading the Bavarian Greens for a couple of years. Unfortunately, passed away 2 years ago. And he was a strong-based Catholic person, is coming from Bavaria, and combined that with the politics of the Green Party. And I learned in talking to him and dealing with him how important religion could be and Catholic ethics could be. However, they need to be open. And they had to, talking about homosexuality and other things, I think they need to be open. And if they do so, and if they deal with the problems people have in their daily life, I think there could be a very, very lively religion. I hope that they will develop in this sense.
Wolfgang Büttner, when you see all that is happening in the Catholic Church and the fact that Pope Francis is really making headlines with his calls for change on a nearly weekly basis, does it call into question for you the legacy of Pope Benedict, the last German Pope?
Well, actually, first of all, it's very difficult for me personally to know what is happening in the corridors of the Vatican. I think that's very difficult to find out. But in general, I mean, we of course, Human Rights Watch of course supports the most recent visit of the Pope to Lampedusa in his public statements, where he pointed to the plight of the refugees, where he asked for an EU approach with regard to the refugee problem, and where he also said that it's a national problem. It's not only a problem which Europe as such can solve, but it's really an international problem. And so very much support the statements and the public remarks which we get from the current Pope.
So it sounds as if you at least believe that there is real substance also behind the shift that this Pope is making?
Well, I think, I mean, I can only agree with the others in the room that, I mean, the Catholic Church is an important player in the world. I mean, there are so many Catholics in the world, so we think the Pope has an important voice, and if he speaks up, that really is the basis for a change.
Martin Gach, not too long ago, the Pope explicitly said in interviews that he does affirm the teachings of the Office for Doctrine that used to be headed by Pope Benedict. What does that tell you about the likelihood that there will be real movement on issues of substance, like homosexuality, birth control, the role of women?
Well, by itself, not much. to be honest. I mean, so very telling was a conversation he had on the plane back from Rio to Rome, in which he was asked by one of the journalists, why doesn't he talk about, abortion, gays, and contraception? And his response was that everybody's aware of what is the position of the church. And then I think that what we can assume from this, following up with this line about he's in no position as a sinner to judge gays, who now are just other sinners. They're not privileged sinners, they're just sinners, just like the rest of us, according to the doctrine. This means that what we can expect is benign neglect. And benign neglect in an institution that is now sort of, first of all, that has sort of the tradition that it has, but second of all, that has a degree of incidence. And I'm talking about very specifically political incidence, because I think that it's important that we bear in mind that politics is the business of turning morality into law. Then in that particular case, benign neglect, or the protection by benign neglect, is actually a big substantive step.
Let me ask you this. Could that benign neglect wind up splitting the church? We've seen members of the Pious Brotherhood this week here in Germany saying that they question where the Pope is taking the church. Certainly Pope Benedict believed that holding on to those conservative values was what preserves the church as an institution. Now I look at the changes, it's almost as if we're talking about a Catholic spring, like the Arab Spring. So far, all the Arab Spring has produced is disintegration.
Well, several things. I mean, the first one is that, yes, we are seeing a Catholic spring. We are seeing a church spring, basically because we're seeing a collapse of political values across the board. There are a lot of models that have essentially failed us. And we're standing in a landscape in which nobody really quite knows what should be the next step to take. So there are certain elements that I think that this man has realized that he can remarket or rebrand. Now, that being said, I think that it's very clear that the criticism to the Pope will come from the right. Theologically, it doesn't have a leg to stand on, because actually one of the principles that remains essential to Vatican doctrine is the infallibility of the Pope. It doesn't get used, but in canonic law, the Pope position is essentially infallible. Number two, the fact is that most of these people were sitting around waiting for Benedict to solve something that he could never really quite solve, and ended up with a church in complete crisis. So,
thank you very much.
You're
Thanks
welcome.
to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. That does wrap up this edition of Agenda. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. Email us at agenda.english@dw.de. Thanks for now. See you soon.